It's a Sunday as I'm posting this video, and so today we're talking all about spirits. And oh, do I have some good stories today. I have chosen 4 stories from my subscribers of their first ever spirit encounters. And there are some really interesting ones in here. We have land spirits, we have spirits that were believed to be animals in the attic, we even have one with a video recording. So, oh, I'm excited. Let's get into this. So the first story is from Tonya, and I don't really know what to call this one. I know that in the last episode I had names for all of them, but this just covers so many strange things. Maybe I'll just call this one The Bruising Ghost. I think that one might be a good fit. Let me begin with a bit of a backstory. The house we lived in at the time wasn't known to be haunted, but as time passed, I realised something about this place was different. It was an old farmhouse perched upon a hill in a long valley, and no other houses were as far as the eye could see. The previous owner was an older gentleman whom had had no children and had only taken a wife in his later years. As time passed, something in the house began to make itself known. My sister's cat, who hated children, started acting very protective of my infant daughter, and I would find her in the crib with my daughter, lying right next to her side. When patrolling the house, the cat would often hiss and make strange meowing sounds as she passed through the hallway. Often, out of the corner of my eye, I would see a shadow, like someone passing a doorway, but when I looked, there was nothing there. For my daughter, the entity appeared to be quite pleasant. I would often hear her happily giggling and babbling as if having the grandest of conversations. Her toys were objects of intrigue. Toy pianos would play during the night, and her talking big bird would often be found playing its tape, but when I know it hadn't been used. Perhaps oddly, I wasn't bothered by this once I learned the history of the house. I just assumed it was the old man. However, one night, things took a decidedly darker turn. As I lay in bed, with a leg out from under the covers, just nearly asleep, I felt a hand touch my leg. Starting near my ankle, I felt it glide up my leg, approaching my thigh. Thinking, of course, it was my then husband looking to get a bit frisky and not feeling in the mood, I reached out my hand to swat him away. Next moment, a hard blow landed squarely on my thigh. I bolted straight up, ready to have a go at him, but the room was empty. I hopped up immediately and looked down the hallway. I could see straight to the living room where my husband was sat, his feet propped up, bowl of popcorn in his lap, watching the TV. There was no way he could have made it that far without making a sound, as the floors were all old hardwood and creaked with every step. I walked to the living room and asked him if he'd just been in the bedroom, and he looked back at me and said, "No, why?" I relayed the story, and he told me that I was just dreaming. However, the next morning, when I awoke, I found a very large bruise on my thigh, right where I felt I was hit the night before. That is so creepy. That one is so good, and there's so many layers to this as well, and I feel like I just want to add like a few little bits and pieces. I know I did this in the last episode and everyone was like, yes, please add more context. So I feel like I want to add like a few little bits in here. So often do we hear stories of houses that like weren't known to be haunted, but they had like the most haunted activity ever. And sometimes I wonder, as I mentioned in the last episode, of whether it's that certain people kind of tune in to different energies. I'm also curious, and obviously all of these forms can be anonymous, there's like no follow-ups for me or whatnot. But I'm wondering if anything was changed in the house, because it seems strange for this house to have gone from being something that wasn't known to be haunted to something that very, very much seems to be haunted. Like, I've experienced this within my own home when renovation work has been done and walls have been drilled into or old pieces of furniture have been moved. you often get a lot of heightened activity. It's like that re-energizes everything and just kind of annoys the energies that are around. And so sometimes you can get way more haunted activity. I don't know if that's the kind of thing that could possibly have happened here, but it definitely seems like something has triggered the events in this story. And I'm wondering if there is like a singular point in time where all of this stuff just kind of started happening. And if at that moment something was added to the house, something was moved, something was changed, like I'm just curious here, like I'm never going to know the answer, but it does make me question it. Then we have the idea of animals reacting to something. And this is really common. Animals and children tend to be the first things to acknowledge the presence of spirits. And some of the time, it's probably because they're more sensitive. I do think, though, that a lot of the time, adults have a tendency to dismiss things as being nothing more than the house settling, the pipes, or it's just a creaky floorboard, it's the cat, don't worry about it. Whereas I think that animals and children have a little bit more of an instinct of, oh, something isn't right, oh, this is different. They have a little bit more of a survival instinct, I think, than adults do when we have a tendency to dismiss things as being nothing more than mundane. A lot of ghosts also have an affinity towards children because children often can interact with them in a way that adults can't. And so you'll often find that children often have more experiences of people trying to play with them, engage with them, because they are more likely to be seen by a child than they would an adult. And then you also have the benefit of a lot of children's toys have batteries, they have electronics. And so that is something that can be influenced by energy. And also they can use that energy to draw on to be able to carry out actions. So a lot of people will notice that battery operated, well, anything, whether it's cameras, whether it's remote controls, will often start dying really quickly and inexplicably. Like there's no reason why your camera that normally lasts for 5 hours has gone dead in 5 minutes. Or there's no reason why the brand new batteries that you just put into a device all of a sudden don't work. It may be that the spirits are actually using that energy to transfer it into something that they can manifest, whether that is sounds, whether that is behavior, movement, things like that. Or in this case, perhaps physical contact, which I think is just really creepy. So I like the fact that in here we almost can see like it ramping up. So we start with like the cat being more protective and the cat acknowledging things. I'm finding it interesting though that your daughter didn't seem to be concerned about this at all, but the cat obviously is. So while that spirit may not have had negative intentions towards your daughter, it seems as though the cat is aware that this person maybe isn't always that nice. And while I'm not necessarily going to assume that this individual is the gentleman that owned the house before, I am wondering if perhaps this is an individual who lived in the house previously who has rather outdated opinions on what is correct and what isn't. So they wouldn't necessarily harm a child, but if you as a woman in that house were to disagree with them, then they would be having problems. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of that, but I'm sure you can kind of follow the breadcrumbs here. I'm wondering if it's perhaps someone who maybe isn't necessarily the nicest person, but it was considered socially acceptable at the time. I'm just finding this a really, really interesting story, and I would love to know if this continued. Like, was this like a regular occurrence? And it definitely seems like an encounter occurred here to be having a bruise in the same place. We see this happening a lot, where people feel like they've like had their arm gripped here, and they think it was just a dream, and then they wake up in the morning and they have like a full handprint right here of where someone is like gripped onto them. So such an interesting story, absolutely fascinating. We then have one which is an encounter with a land spirit. Now, this one was submitted by Melanie, and this is one of the unusual ones of someone who has had like a long-term relationship with a particular spirit. So, hi Hearth, this is my story about my first encounter with a spirit, a land spirit. Years ago, in my late teens, we visited our local forest camping with friends, and I had a dream of an old man. It was a very vivid dream, much more vivid than a normal dream, and I remember it all. In my dream, the man didn't speak. That would come later. We walked around for a long time and he gestured at plants, trees, and fungi, and in my dream, I came to understand I was going to be the caretaker of this place. I returned to the forest many times after that and learned more about the flora and fauna, and eventually, in a ritual, I offered my assistance to the land spirit. Incredibly, not long after, my partner and I had the opportunity to purchase the land and live there permanently to protect it. This is what the old man wanted. He was reaching out, and in future dreams, many years apart, we eventually started audibly speaking. I had a lot of questions. He's real, and he says he's always been here. He can't be summoned. He thought that was really funny. He tells me that he's a nature spirit, a guardian spirit, and a teacher. He has shown me medicinal plants, food plants, and even poisonous plants. He visits other places and people if he wants to, but always in the forest. I asked him his name, and he said that he was so old he doesn't have one. I still today don't know what it is. He is a being of nature. He just is, as he always was. This was more than 30 years ago now. I'm 50, and I talk to him every day. We eventually got formal protection for the forest, and we get to live here and share the place. I'm very grateful. That is just such a cool story, and land spirits are incredibly interesting. They are very, very old, and they are linked to place. They're linked to the land. This is different from, say, a haunting of the land. So this would be, for instance, if a battle had taken place on a particular patch of land. That land is then haunted by the spirits, but those spirits aren't land spirits. They are just spirits who happen to be attached to the land. It's different. Here, we call them land wights, but they're also known as genus loci, and they are essentially the spirits of place. And they are a representation, a guardian figure, a being that is linked intrinsically to the land. Like, they are one and the same. You cannot separate them apart. And when working with them, we can gain information about the place. We can gain an understanding of the local plants, the local animals, the history of the land, and they can be really, really fulfilling relationships. And so I think this is really a beautiful story of someone who's had like such a long expanse of time to be connecting and working with one of these spirits. It's not that common to actually hear about. People do work with them, but it's not something that you hear about in the same way as, say, deities or servitors and the like. It's something that people don't speak about that much. So this one was just so lovely to me. So the next one is a ghost on video. And this one actually came linked to a Ring camera recording of these events taking place, which I will, of course, be playing on the screen. This one is from Amy, and it was one of the earlier ones I had in, actually, and I have been looking forward to sharing this one since. It's very brief, but it's quite impactful. So this is really my daughter's story. My son passed away in October of 2022, and my daughter would always tell me that he was messing with her, flipping the lights on and off in her room, etc. Then, in March of 2023, our Ring camera caught a hairbrush falling off the kitchen counter seemingly by itself. After watching it over and over, I noticed something sweep in front of the camera before the brush fell off. Maybe a fairy instead of my son. So this is the video in question. I would love to get everyone's opinions. Now, when it comes to the fair folk, they will often be accompanied by additional context. So it may well be that you spent a lot of time in nature recently. It may be that they are accompanied by a very sweet, almost sickly smell. It's not like the smell of death. It's more like very, very strong candy, like sugary, sweet type smell. And they may also be accompanied by the sound of tinkling bells. When we see them, depending on how accustomed you are to working with and seeing spirits, you might see them as a being of light. They could be a light orb, something like a will-o-wisp. Sometimes they are described as being glowing beings that are made out of light, a little bit like a story in the last episode. Sometimes they are small, sometimes they are ginormous. It really depends on how you connect with them. But if your daughter is specifically saying that it could be your son that is messing with the lights and stuff, maybe it could be worth asking for a little bit of additional context as to who is around, what is in this space. And you might find that that context is really significant to seeing what comes next. If it is related to nature or the natural world, or it's not really related to anyone or anything that you know, you may well be dealing with a spirit that is completely separate from your family entirely. And the playing of lights and the messing around does kind of fall into what some members of the Fae would do, so that's definitely an option. Or you might find that it is something that you recognize, that you connect with, and so then it could be worth looking into other avenues too. But I want to say that I'm really, really sorry for your loss, and a lot of the topics and a lot of the stories that we get in do contain a lot of loss, because that is how a lot of ghost stories do start. So thank you so much for being open and being willing to share your story with me, as well as anyone else who decides to. But that one I thought was just really, really interesting because it did come with this Ring camera footage, and it just is so eye-opening. So the last one for today's video is one that I also have no idea what to call it. So I might just call it the attic spirit, because there's a lot going on in this story. So let's get into it. The August before I turned 19, I was still living at home while going to community college. This was also the year that my dad bought a little house in the 1980s. Now, I was familiar with this house before we moved in, because it is directly across the street from where my best friend lives. We had been in this neighbourhood multiple times through the years, and so when we packed up to move, I didn't have any alarm bells going off. Then, after the first couple of weeks, I started to see shadows, specifically in the corner of the kitchen. I also started hearing noises coming from the attic in the middle of the night, so much so that I convinced my dad to hire an exterminator, who wound up finding zero evidence of animals in the attic. It even freaked out the exterminator, because that little level of animal activity was below normal for our area. A few of my friends and my brother started to pick up on the strange energy in the house too. Well, at the same time all of this was happening, my dad got diagnosed with bronchitis. He took antibiotics for it, but never got back to feeling 100%. Then, when January came around, I was used to the noises and the weird feelings that I would get in the kitchen, until one weekend, my dad spiked with a fever. He went to the doctor and was diagnosed with flu plus some serious pneumonia. The doctor said that he had to go to the hospital and get IV antibiotics, and to expect to stay there for a few days. We left my brother at home while I took him and dropped him off. My dad's girlfriend, who was not living with us, met us there and told me that I should go home. After spending the whole day in the hospital, I made it back to the house with dinner and spent the evening getting my brother ready to go back to school after the winter break. Later that night, I went into the kitchen to get something to drink, and as I crossed the threshold from the living room, the amount of weird energy in the kitchen stopped me in my tracks. The best way I can think to describe it was that there was a heavy, charged feeling, almost like the entire room was connected to a car battery. As I stood there, I felt my head turn almost on instinct to the light above the sink. Then, like I had laser vision, the dome around the light bulb exploded. The light was not on, and so it hadn't been too hot, and the light bulb was perfectly fine. I wouldn't know it until the next morning, but around that same time, my dad was having what the doctors called a major cardiac event. After a week in the hospital, he was released and is doing fine now. That was the last time myself or anyone felt anything weird in the house, and the noises in the attic have stopped. Hills. That one is absolutely bonkers. Now, that's one of those where it's like a roller coaster, because at the start I'm thinking, oh, is the spirit activity actually triggering the events that are happening? Like, because sometimes when you have heightened spirit activity in the house, if someone, for instance, has died of something related to their chest, like pneumonia, you might find that those symptoms start presenting in the people that are experiencing the haunting. So at first I'm like, oh, is that what's happening here? Then you have the strange animal activity. Now, animals, as I've already mentioned this episode, are very, very sensitive to spirits. Sometimes they're very attracted to spirits. Sometimes they're very fearful of them. So initially I'm thinking, oh no, these animals know to stay away from this place. But then the fact that all of this stopped after this awful event, I can't imagine what it must have been like to go through that as a family. That makes me wonder whether all of this is like a warning, like a, please be careful. I want to let you know that something is going to happen. I don't know how to let you know that something is going to happen. So I'm going to do everything I can to tell you that something bad is going to happen. Because there's a reason that we reach out to spirits during divination. There's a reason that we work with them with tarot. It's because they often have information that we don't have access to. Now, whether that is all information, future and past, whether that's just an insight into things that we don't have, we're really never going to know that. But so many spirits have information that we don't have access to, that it does make me wonder if in this situation, the entire thing was building up to this event, and the spirits that are there maybe were completely dormant before, and they started to realize, hang on, we need to bring their attention to this, and this is the only way that they could do it. Either way, that is an absolutely incredible story. And I'm curious, I know that you could never know, as to whether or not people who lived in the house before experienced similar circumstances before bad events happened. That would be really interesting. So those are the stories for today's video. I hope that you did enjoy them. A massive thank you to everyone who has submitted their stories so far. If you have a first ever ghost encounter and would like to include it in a future video, please do so by clicking the link in the description box and submitting your story on the submission page. In the coming weeks, I will be opening it up to other types of stories, so I'll let you know when those are available, and I will try to include those links as well. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to give it a like. It really means a lot to me. If you would like more ghosty, haunted content, I will leave the playlist of all of my spirit videos so far down in the description box. And if you do enjoy the magical content on this channel or in this video, feel free to hit subscribe. I try to post magical content every single week. So with that being said, I hope you're staying safe. I hope you have a marvelous magical day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!